A black teenager is asked to give up his VIP seat for a white passenger. One phone call to his powerful CEO father, and everything changes instantly. What would you do if someone tried to take what rightfully belonged to you simply because they thought their status allowed them to be treated with special privileges? On what seemed like an ordinary flight, a young boy's quiet determination and his CEO father's strong intervention turned a moment of arrogance into a profound lesson in respect and justice, one that no one on board would ever forget. In the luxury and tranquility of the first-class cabin, Jalen Carter sat upright in seat 1A, his curious eyes filled with pride. It was the first time the 15-year-old was flying alone, without his father by his side. His father, Marcus Carter, the renowned CEO of the top tech firm Carter Technologies, often appeared in business news and was always busy with global business trips. However, no matter how busy he was, Marcus always made sure to give the best to his son. He had personally booked Jalen the VIP seat 1A, a coveted position that everyone on a flight would desire. Jalen gently leaned his head back on the seat, smiling contentedly as he felt the softness of the leather. A flight attendant approached, smiling as she asked him politely, "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Carter?" "Yes, I'll have some orange juice, please," Jalen replied respectfully, earning the attendant's warm approval. Holding the glass of orange juice, Jalen felt both happiness and pride. It wasn't about the luxury, it was because he knew this was a special gift from his father, a chance for him to experience and mature. Looking out the window, watching the sunset slowly disappear behind distant mountain ranges, Jalen took a deep breath, filled with hopes for the journey ahead. Little did he know, on this seemingly peaceful flight, a storm named prejudice was about to strike, completely altering his perfect evening. As Jalen continued to gaze out the window at the soft sunset, the sound of high heels clicking clearly down the aisle made him turn his head slightly. A middle-aged white woman, draped in a light cream designer coat and a form-fitting dress that exuded elegance, stood at the entrance to the VIP section with a scrutinizing, displeased look. This woman was Evelyn Stokes, a longtime passenger with the Platinum Elite status, a title she often used to claim the most privileged perks. Evelyn's cold, sharp gaze immediately fixed on seat 1A, where Jalen was sitting, her eyebrows furrowing and her face clearly showing dissatisfaction. She let out a heavy sigh, making sure to draw the attention of everyone around her. A few seconds later, her voice rose sharply, calling the flight attendant nearby in an irritated tone, "Excuse me. There's definitely some mistake here. Why is this seat being taken by a boy?" The sudden voice interrupted the quiet of the cabin, causing a few passengers to glance around. The flight attendant politely approached Evelyn, checked the details on her tablet, and replied, "Sorry, Mrs. Stokes, but according to the information I've checked, Seat 1A is indeed reserved for passenger Jalen Carter." Evelyn furrowed her brows even further, her voice growing harsher, her eyes filled with disdain as she looked at the boy. "Impossible! Do you know who I am? I'm a Platinum Elite member. I always sit in Seat 1A on every flight. You better check again immediately." Evelyn's insistence and loud tone made the atmosphere in the VIP cabin tense. Jalen felt a bit awkward and subconsciously tightened his grip on his orange juice, but he still tried to remain calm. He had been taught by his father from a young age about the value of patience and politeness, even when dealing with people who showed disrespect. The flight attendant once again carefully checked and confirmed. "Mrs. Stokes, I'm sorry, but I've double-checked. This seat does indeed belong to Mr. Carter. Perhaps your seat is a different one. I can help you find—" Before she could finish, Evelyn immediately cut her off, her voice turning cold and sharp, her eyes piercing straight into Jalen. "No way. I've paid too much and been loyal to this airline for too many years to be treated like this. A boy like him shouldn't even be sitting in first class. I demand that you give up that seat for me, right now." Evelyn's harsh words hit Jalen like an invisible knife, making him feel a flush of heat on his face. But even in this unexpected situation, he held the composed demeanor his father had taught him, responding softly yet firmly, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is my seat and I cannot give it up." The cabin fell into a tense silence after Jalen's polite but resolute reply. Evelyn stood frozen, her face flushed with anger and disappointment, as her familiar sense of power was challenged for the first time by a 15-year-old boy. In that moment, Evelyn vowed she would never let a regular child stand in the way of her status on this flight. The real storm of the journey had begun, but Jalen Carter remained steadfast in Seat 1A, ready to face whatever was to come next. Jalen's gentle but firm refusal left Evelyn stunned for a moment. The atmosphere in the VIP cabin suddenly became more stifling than ever. A few passengers nearby began to glance over, their looks a mix of curiosity and discomfort at the unexpected commotion. The flight attendant seemed a little flustered, looking at Evelyn with a cautious expression and politely reiterating, "Mrs. Stokes, I've double-checked Mr. Carter's ticket. This seat is indeed reserved for him." Evelyn paid no attention to the confirmation. Her gaze grew colder, her teeth clenched tightly to control the rising anger. She leaned down close to Jalen, speaking in a lowered yet clear and sarcastic tone. "You should be sitting somewhere more appropriate for your age. A child like you wouldn't understand the comfort and value of this VIP seat." Every word Evelyn spoke was deliberately emphasized, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly. Her tone dripped with disdain, as if Jalen's presence in this seat was a personal insult. The gazes around her shifted toward Jalen, some curious, some sympathetic, but most remained silent, waiting to see what would happen next. In that moment, Jalen felt his palms tremble slightly, but he still held on to the politeness his father had taught him. He took a deep breath, looked Evelyn squarely in the eye, and responded gently yet firmly, "Ma'am, my father personally reserved this seat for me. I am fully capable of sitting in the seat I've been assigned, and I have no intention of moving." Jalen's words were calm but resolute, showing maturity beyond his years. It struck Evelyn like a blow to her pride. Angrily, she stood upright, her eyes flashing with an anger she could no longer hide. Her voice turned into a clear threat as she addressed the flight attendant. "I have never been treated like this in all my years flying with this airline. You'd better call a supervisor here now. I won't let this go." The flight attendant flinched at Evelyn's forceful demand, quickly nodding and hurriedly walking off to find a supervisor. The tension in the cabin thickened. Evelyn stood with her arms crossed, her face stern, her eyes still locked on Jalen, trying to use her power to crush the confidence of the young boy. What Evelyn didn't know was that Jalen had been prepared by his father for situations like this, when power and prejudice deliberately challenge integrity. He sat upright, his calm gaze directed out the window, silently reminding himself that he would never allow anyone to diminish his worth because of his age or skin color. The atmosphere in the cabin grew even more suffocating and tense, like a balloon pumped to its limit, just waiting for the slightest pressure to make it burst. After Evelyn's forceful demand, the flight attendant hurriedly left the cabin, quickly heading toward the crew area to seek help. Whispers began to spread among the passengers. Curious and scrutinizing glances turned toward Jalen and Evelyn, the central figures of the incident. Just a few minutes later, hurried footsteps echoed clearly from the front of the cabin. A woman in her 40s appeared, exuding confidence, with light blonde hair neatly tied back and dressed in a blue uniform with a matching scarf tied neatly around her neck. This was Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor, a woman with years of experience handling issues on international flights. Her eyes quickly scanned the cabin, pausing on Evelyn before shifting to the boy sitting in seat 1A. Deborah walked over to Evelyn with a calm smile, a gesture typically reserved for priority passengers. She quickly addressed Evelyn politely. "Sorry for the inconvenience, Mrs. Stokes. I just heard from the attendant about the issue here. Could you please tell me what the specific problem is?" Evelyn exhaled sharply, her face still filled with displeasure, her voice thick with irritation. "Miss Deborah, I've been flying first class with this airline for years. You know who I am. I'm a Platinum Elite customer, and I always sit in seat 1A on every flight. Now, a boy is sitting in my seat, and when I asked him to move, he refused disrespectfully." Deborah furrowed her brow, her eyes quickly shifting from Evelyn to Jalen as if assessing the situation. With her professional instincts, Deborah knew Evelyn was an important customer, one who regularly contributed significant revenue to the airline. Confronting or upsetting this powerful woman wasn't a wise decision, but she also felt a brief hesitation as she looked at Jalen, a 15-year-old boy sitting calmly and silently, waiting for her response. After a brief moment of consideration, Deborah gently turned to Jalen, her voice soft yet carrying an underlying authority. "Hello, you must be Jalen Carter, right? I understand that this seat was reserved by your father, but sometimes in situations like this, we need to be a bit flexible to avoid inconveniencing other passengers. What do you think about moving to another seat, equally comfortable, so that Mrs. Stokes can sit here and the flight can depart on time?" Deborah's words were gentle and polite, but clearly implied that Jalen's refusal to move could lead to a flight delay. This was a psychological tactic Deborah often used, tapping into the natural discomfort of the listener, especially when the other party was just a child. Upon hearing this, Evelyn's eyes immediately flashed with a smug satisfaction that she couldn't hide. She folded her arms, tilted her head slightly, and seemed confident that the issue would now be resolved in her favor. However, contrary to Deborah and Evelyn's expectations, Jalen remained unfazed. The boy looked at Deborah with polite but firm eyes and responded clearly and calmly. "I understand what you're saying, Miss Lane, but I really don't think I need to leave the seat my father reserved for me. I'm not trying to cause trouble for anyone, but I believe I deserve the same respect as any other passenger on this flight." Jalen's response, calm yet decisive, left Deborah speechless for a moment. She hadn't expected such a wise and firm reply from a 15-year-old. It made her feel awkward. Nevertheless, Evelyn didn't back down and immediately spoke up again, her tone growing sharper. "Deborah, are you really wasting time with a child? I don't want to stand here and argue any longer. Once again, I demand this seat immediately." Deborah bit her lip, feeling the immense pressure from Evelyn. At that moment, the decision before her was clearer than ever: either side with the powerful VIP customer, or protect the rightful position of the boy and risk her career. Deborah turned to Jalen once more, her face no longer calm but clearly tense. "Jalen, this is just a small change, a gesture of goodwill. I really hope you reconsider for the sake of the flight." Deborah's words were more forceful now, making the atmosphere around them even heavier. Yet Jalen remained unshaken. He looked straight into Deborah's eyes, gently shaking his head and answering once again with an uncommon composure for his age. "I'm sorry, Miss Lane, but I've thought about it carefully. I will keep my seat." At that moment, Evelyn nearly exploded with rage. Her face turned bright red, her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. She turned to Deborah, nearly shouting, This is unacceptable. I want this issue resolved immediately by any means necessary." Deborah stood frozen, knowing that the situation had gone beyond her control. She sighed deeply, reluctantly picked up the radio, and whispered something to the attendant beside her, her gaze filled with concern as she glanced back at the calm but determined boy sitting in his seat. The tension on the flight had begun to escalate, and Deborah knew that the decisions made next could completely alter the careers and lives of everyone involved, especially hers and Jalen Carter's. After the tense conversation, the atmosphere in the VIP cabin seemed to calm somewhat. But when Jalen politely yet firmly asserted that he would not leave his seat, Evelyn seemed unable to control the rising anger within her. Her eyes flashed with fury, her face flushed red, and the sharp features that were usually meticulously maintained now became stiff and full of hostility. Unable to hold back any longer, Evelyn took a step forward, raising her authoritative arm and pointing directly at Jalen, her voice loud with contempt and disdain. "Boy, are you really shameless? How long will it take for a child like you to learn that the world doesn't revolve around your wishes? Do you think just sitting there will grant you whatever your father paid for? How laughable." Evelyn's high-pitched and venomous voice echoed through the cabin, causing the entire VIP section, previously silent, to erupt in murmurs. Passengers turned their heads, curious and shocked, their eyes locked on Evelyn and Jalen. A few frowned, clearly annoyed by the unnecessary noise, but most remained silent, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Jalen tried to keep his face calm, but he couldn't hide the slight confusion and hurt that flashed in his eyes. He never imagined the situation would escalate so quickly. A heavy feeling rose in his chest, but Jalen forced himself to breathe deeply, recalling his father's advice when faced with similar situations. Always maintain your composure and dignity, because dignity is what earns the respect of others. But Evelyn didn't stop. Fueled by Jalen's calmness and the silence surrounding him, she turned to the other passengers, seeking their support, and loudly declared, "Look, everyone. This is what happens when we let a child sit in a seat that doesn't belong to him. I've been a loyal customer of this airline for years, and now I'm being treated like a stranger just because some foolish father wants to pamper his son. Do you think that's fair?" Evelyn's harsh and deliberate words made the entire cabin tense. Some passengers began to whisper, their eyes filled with curiosity, sympathy, but also suspicion or ill will. The crowd, as always, was easily swayed by emotional and sarcastic remarks. Evelyn knew this, and deliberately played on the situation to increase pressure on Jalen. At this point, Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor, seemed to be caught in the middle of this difficult situation. She stood still, her face tense, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Her career and professional reputation seemed to hang by a thin thread, and deciding between right and wrong had never felt more difficult. But Evelyn wasn't about to stop. The more she spoke, the more agitated she became, her voice rising and becoming sharper. "I'll tell all of you, if this airline does not resolve this absurd situation right now, I will call my lawyer and the major newspapers. I will make sure this issue is brought to light so that everyone will know how this airline treats its loyal customers." Evelyn's harsh declaration caused an immediate stir in the cabin. The passengers now seemed anxious, their whispers growing louder, their eyes filled with tension and concern. No one wanted their flight delayed, and even more so, no one wanted to be involved in the scandal Evelyn threatened to cause. A few passengers sighed in annoyance, while others looked at Jalen with pity, as if blaming him for causing this trouble. Jalen could feel the isolation, which only made him more uncomfortable and agitated. However, deep down, Jalen knew he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply standing up for his rightful and legitimate rights. Evelyn could clearly see that her psychological tactics were having an effect. She stood up straighter, her eyes glowing with triumphant self-satisfaction, her haughty expression sharper than ever. Looking down at the boy still sitting silently, Evelyn smiled coldly, confidently adding one more line, as if to completely push him into a disadvantaged position. "Now, do you understand the problem? Or are you going to continue causing trouble for everyone?" Jalen lifted his head to look at her, his eyes clear but full of determination. He knew this was no longer just about him, but a test of the self-respect and dignity his father had taught him. He didn't respond to Evelyn, instead silently looking into her eyes, waiting for what would happen next, no matter how difficult or challenging it might be. Amidst Evelyn's harsh words and the increasingly scrutinizing gazes of the surrounding passengers, Jalen felt an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. Though he tried to maintain a calm exterior, deep inside, he began to feel a discomfort and restlessness that was hard to put into words. He instinctively reached for the phone in his jacket pocket, seeking comfort and reassurance from his most trusted source. In that brief moment, the image of his father, Marcus Carter, appeared clearly in Jalen's mind. His father, the man who was always steady and composed in any situation, suddenly became the anchor Jalen needed. His father had always told him that whenever he felt stuck or under pressure, he could always call and seek his support. That thought gave Jalen just enough courage to face the current challenge. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Jalen gently stood up from his seat. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but he knew he needed a private conversation with his father to handle the matter properly. He quickly made his way toward the VIP cabin door and discreetly signaled the flight attendant that he needed a moment alone to make a call. The attendant quickly nodded understandingly, stepping aside to allow Jalen to move toward the rear of the plane, where fewer passengers would notice him. Once behind the blue curtain, Jalen took his phone out of his jacket pocket, took another deep breath to regain his composure, and dialed his father's number. As he waited for the phone to ring, his heart pounded louder than ever. Finally, his father's familiar calm voice came through the receiver, offering Jalen an unexpected sense of peace. "This is Dad, Jalen. What's going on?" Hearing his father's voice, Jalen felt as if he had found a solid foundation amidst the storm. He tried to keep his tone soft, not wanting his father to hear the worry in his voice too clearly, but still conveying the situation. "Dad, I'm on the flight, but there's a problem. A woman named Evelyn Stokes keeps insisting I leave the seat you reserved for me. She's really angry and threatening to call her lawyer and the press to force me to move. The flight supervisor is also siding with her and wants me to switch seats. I don't know what to do." The last words trailed off as Jalen's voice became tinged with the worry and uncertainty he had been trying to hide. Marcus paused on the other end of the line for a moment, as though processing the information. As someone who was always calm and decisive in stressful situations, Marcus knew that the most important thing in this moment was to help his son maintain his emotional stability. His voice came through firm and reassuring, with just a touch of calm determination. "Listen to me, Jalen. First of all, you need to stay calm and not let anyone shake your confidence. I know you haven't done anything wrong, and you have every right to sit in the seat we reserved. I'll handle this right away, so don't worry about it, okay?" Hearing his father's words, Jalen felt an overwhelming sense of strength and safety flood back into him. Marcus had always been firm, resolute, and able to solve problems effectively. Jalen knew that when his father said he would handle something, it would be resolved. But he still couldn't help but ask, his voice slightly hesitant, "But Dad, Do you think this situation might affect your work or the meeting? I don't want to bother you while you're busy. Marcus let out a soft laugh, a gentle and affectionate laugh that he always reserved for Jalen in moments like this. Jalen, there's no meeting more important to me than you. Work can always be rearranged, but you come first. Go back to your seat and stay calm, stay confident. I promise you this will be sorted out soon. His father's words gave Jalen an invisible strength. He replied with a tone that had softened, the tension now replaced with gratitude and absolute trust in his father. Yes, I understand. Thank you, Dad, for always being there for me. The call ended, and Jalen gently slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket before returning to the VIP cabin. As he walked back to his seat, he saw that Evelyn was still standing there, her face full of smug satisfaction, as if waiting for him to give in. But Jalen simply smiled calmly, sat down with even more poise and certainty than before. He knew that, far away, his father was already taking action, and whatever happened next would surely shift the balance in his favor, ensuring that he would regain the respect and fairness he truly deserved. As soon as Jalen returned to his seat, his calm yet strangely confident demeanor surprised Evelyn. She furrowed her brow, wondering what the boy had just done in those few minutes. But Evelyn quickly dismissed her doubts, telling herself that there was nothing a child like him could have done to change the situation now. However, thousands of miles away, in the office on the top floor of the Carter Technologies headquarters, Marcus Carter did not take his son's call lightly. As soon as he hung up the phone, Marcus immediately shifted from his calm demeanor to a stern one. Without hesitation, he ordered the immediate pause of the executive meeting he was leading. All eyes in the meeting room turned toward Marcus, filled with confusion and curiosity. It was rare for him to interrupt such an important meeting, especially with the company handling a multi-billion-dollar project. But Marcus simply nodded to reassure everyone, swiftly walking out of the room with his phone in hand, displaying a firm attitude that no one dared question. Marcus entered his private office and immediately dialed the senior office of the airline. He knew that this was one of their important partners, with whom he had met on several occasions at major collaborative events. But this time, his voice was cold and authoritative, starkly different from his usual polite tone. The phone rang only twice before it was quickly answered, and the voice of a middle-aged man came on the line, speaking with utmost respect. "Hello, Mr. Carter. It's a pleasure to receive your call. How can I assist you today?" Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight to the point, his voice steady but very strict. "I just received a call from my son, Jalen Carter. He is on one of your flights and is currently facing severe harassment from a passenger named Evelyn Stokes, along with the irresponsible handling of the flight crew. I want this issue dealt with immediately and thoroughly." The man on the other end was taken aback by Marcus's authoritative tone. He understood very well that the person he was speaking to was none other than the CEO of Carter Technologies, a prestigious company with vast economic and media influence. Marcus Carter wasn't one to lose his temper easily, but when he expressed his dissatisfaction, it meant the situation was very serious. The man quickly responded, his voice a bit flustered. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for this incident. I completely understand the seriousness of the matter. Could you please provide more specific details about the situation?" Marcus replied coldly. "My son was forced to leave the seat I had reserved for him, publicly insulted by another passenger, and worse, your staff, including the flight supervisor, not only failed to protect his rightful position but sided with the troublemaker. I don't need to say any more. This is absolutely unacceptable." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, as the man seemed to carefully consider his next words. Finally, he spoke sincerely and cautiously. "Mr. Carter, I assure you that we will handle this situation immediately. I will contact the captain of the flight to clarify the situation, and a senior representative from our airline will meet with Jalen to apologize and address the involved parties accordingly. Please trust that we do not condone this behavior." Marcus, though slightly softened, remained authoritative. "I hope your commitment doesn't stop at mere words. I need clear, decisive action on this flight right now. If not, you know very well the consequences when this story hits the media. I'm sure it won't be good for your airline's image and reputation." The man on the other end responded immediately, his voice firm and committed. "I fully understand, Mr. Carter. I will ensure that this issue is resolved immediately. I will contact the flight crew directly and instruct them to take the necessary measures to protect Jalen's rights." Marcus nodded slightly, though the man on the other end couldn't see it, his tone now a bit gentler but still firm and resolute. "Good. I'll wait for your update. I hope the next time we speak it's about something more positive." After ending the call, Marcus placed the phone down on his desk. He sat in silence for a few seconds, then took a deep breath. Though a strong and decisive man, he was also a father, and he knew that what he had just done was the best way to protect his son from unnecessary pressure. He trusted that the situation would be resolved satisfactorily. Meanwhile, on the flight, no one knew that a real storm of power was about to descend, aimed at completely ending the injustices and pressure Jalen was enduring. Those involved would soon realize that they had crossed a line they should never have crossed. As soon as Marcus Carter finished his call with the senior executive of the airline, a suffocating tension still hung over the VIP cabin of the flight. Evelyn, who seemed to have completely won the battle, stood there with an air of arrogance, repeatedly glancing at her wristwatch impatiently, as though waiting for an inevitable concession from Jalen. Meanwhile, Jalen remained seated, his face entirely calm, his gaze sending a powerful message that he had no intention of yielding to the injustice. Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor, stood beside Evelyn, but her eyes betrayed an increasing unease. She kept glancing toward the cabin door, clearly hoping for some intervention to resolve this awkward situation as quickly as possible. The flight attendant, Greg, stood next to her, also visibly anxious, his eyes frequently darting toward Deborah as if seeking guidance. The silence in the cabin began to wear on the other passengers, with whispers and murmurs growing louder. And then, just when the tension seemed unbearable, the door leading into the cabin suddenly swung open. All eyes immediately turned toward it, and the appearance of two well-dressed men, clad in formal black suits, made both Deborah and Greg freeze in shock. These two men were none other than senior representatives from the airline's management office, people who only appeared in person when serious issues arose. Their eyes quickly scanned the entire cabin upon entering, pausing immediately at the spot where Jalen and Evelyn stood, and then focusing directly on Deborah and Greg with a chilling, stern gaze. Deborah's face instantly turned pale, a shiver running down her spine. As someone who had worked in the industry for years, Deborah understood that the sudden appearance of these men was not a good sign. Next to her, Greg also became flustered, his hands instinctively intertwining as he tried to hide the tension building inside him. One of the senior representatives, a stern-looking man with neatly combed silver hair, took a step forward and spoke in a clear, authoritative voice that echoed throughout the cabin, making sure everyone heard. "I am Robert Evans, senior representative of the airline. We have just received a report about a very serious incident on this flight. We are here to directly clarify the situation and take immediate action." As he spoke, Robert scanned the cabin once more, then quickly turned to Deborah Lane, his voice growing colder than ever. Ms. Lane, I need you to explain clearly why such a situation was allowed to happen. Why was a validly reserved seat taken from one passenger and not protected by your staff? The sharp question struck Deborah like a dagger to her heart, leaving her almost speechless. In that moment, all her previous confidence seemed to vanish. She glanced at Evelyn, who now, too, had lost her initial smugness, her wide eyes filled with surprise and confusion, as if she couldn't understand what was happening. Deborah tried to regain her composure, but her voice trembled as she responded, "Mr. Evans, I was just trying to quickly resolve the situation to avoid delays. Mrs. Stokes is a long-time VIP customer of the airline, and she made it clear that this seat has always been hers, so I suggested the boy move to settle things quickly." Robert Evans immediately raised his hand to cut her off, his gaze now chillingly cold. "So, you admit to siding with a disruptive passenger instead of protecting the rightful position of another passenger, simply for personal reasons. Is this how you handle problems?" The atmosphere in the cabin became eerily silent, the only sound being the distant hum of the airplane's engines. The other passengers sat still, attentively listening to the tense exchange unfolding right before them, each with a different expression. Some satisfied to see justice being served, others anxious, fearful that the flight would be delayed even more. While Deborah stood there, unable to answer, Robert Evans turned to Jalen, his voice softening immediately, full of respect and sincerity. "You are Jalen Carter, right? On behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for what has happened. We are committed to addressing this matter seriously and ensuring that your rights are absolutely respected." The clear, decisive, and sincere words from the senior representative gave Jalen an unexpected sense of relief. Evelyn stood there, stunned, as if struck by a powerful blow. All her plans, all her perceived power, seemed to dissolve into thin air. And Deborah, along with Greg, now understood better than ever that they were facing the consequences of a serious mistake. A mistake that perhaps would cost them their careers. The tension in the VIP cabin grew even more suffocating after Robert Evans' stern but sincere words. An absolute silence engulfed the cabin, broken only by the soft, steady hum of the airplane engines echoing from afar, creating a stark contrast to the dramatic situation unfolding inside. After personally apologizing to Jalen, Evans turned back to face Deborah and Greg, his expression now even more serious and decisive. Standing beside him, the other representative, a younger man, Matthew Hughes, who was no less serious, quietly observed the situation with sharp, calculating eyes, as if evaluating every move that was unfolding. Evans cleared his throat, adjusted his shirt collar calmly but with authority, then spoke clearly and seriously, ensuring that all passengers in the cabin could hear. After directly verifying the incident and consulting with senior leadership of the airline, we have decided to suspend the flight supervisor Deborah Lane and attendant Greg Thompson immediately due to their unprofessional handling of the situation, unfairness, and severe bias in dealing with the matter. As soon as Evans' statement rang out, the entire cabin fell into stunned silence. Deborah, who had just moments ago held her confident position as the flight supervisor, now turned ashen, as if all the blood had drained from her face. She stood frozen, her wide eyes filled with shock, as though unable to believe what she had just heard. Her lips trembled, wanting to protest, but it seemed every word was stuck in her throat. Greg, the attendant standing next to Deborah, fared no better. He took a small step back, his normally calm and professional demeanor now visibly flustered. His eyes darted between Evans and Matthew Hughes, as if searching for an explanation, or at least a chance to salvage the situation. After a long, suffocating silence, Deborah finally mustered some courage, her voice weak and trembling as she tried to speak, a mix of astonishment and desperation in her tone. "Mr. Evans, I truly don't understand why the airline would make such a severe decision here. I was simply trying to handle the situation quickly to avoid delays. I never intended to favor anyone." But Evans didn't let her finish. He raised his hand gently but firmly to cut her off, his cold gaze fixed on Deborah with an unwavering finality. "Miss Lane, this decision was not made impulsively or hastily. We received information and thoroughly verified the situation before making this decision. I trust you understand why you are being held accountable for this." Greg, seemingly triggered by Deborah's words, spoke up with a shaky voice tinged with anger. "But sir, I was just following orders and trying to keep the peace in the cabin. Why am I being suspended immediately like this?" Matthew Hughes, the second representative, finally spoke. His voice was stern but surprisingly calm. "Greg, as a flight attendant directly serving passengers, you are responsible for protecting the rights of everyone equally. Yet you chose to remain silent and did not speak up when a young passenger's legal rights were clearly violated. That is unacceptable by the ethical and professional standards of this airline." No words of defense came from Deborah or Greg. They stood still, the weight of their helplessness and despair heavy on both of them. Just then, two airport security officers quickly entered the cabin and walked straight toward Deborah and Greg, their expressions serious and decisive. "Please gather your personal belongings and come with us immediately. The airline has requested that you leave the aircraft at this moment." Deborah and Greg exchanged desperate glances, seemingly unable to believe their current circumstances. They both knew that leaving the aircraft in this situation meant the end of their careers, everything they had worked for up until now. But with no other choice, they reluctantly began walking toward the security officers, under the curious and judgmental gazes of the surrounding passengers. Before leaving, Deborah glanced back at Evelyn, who stood frozen, completely shocked. Evelyn had once been confident in the power and favoritism she regularly received from the airline, but now that had vanished in an instant. When the cabin door closed behind Deborah and Greg, the plane seemed to be freed from a large portion of the invisible pressure. The passengers began to murmur among themselves, some relieved to see justice being served, while others were still stunned by what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Evans approached Jalen, speaking gently and sincerely. "Jalen, once again, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for what you've experienced. We are committed to ensuring that from now on, you will receive the service and respect that you truly deserve." Jalen nodded gently, his heart filled with gratitude and relief, knowing that justice had finally been served. But he also understood more than ever that the challenges on this journey were far from over. As soon as the cabin door closed behind Deborah and Greg, a sense of relief briefly swept through the plane. However, this moment of peace lasted only a few seconds before Evelyn, the once powerful woman who seemed untouchable, immediately reacted with fury. Evelyn's face was now red with anger, her sharp eyes flashing with fury as if she had been deeply offended by the recent decision. With her pride wounded, she quickly marched toward Mr. Evans, pointing her finger directly at him without hesitation, her voice rising in a sharp, challenging tone. "Mr. Evans, I cannot accept the way you've handled this. I've made it very clear that I am a long-time Platinum Elite customer. I have every right to be prioritized and served the best. Now you fire your employees just because they tried to meet my legitimate demands? I demand to meet the captain immediately to address this blatant injustice." Evelyn deliberately emphasized every word, ensuring the entire VIP cabin could hear her, as if to assert her unchallenged power and status. The passengers around them began to murmur again, their curious and anxious eyes turning toward the cabin door, waiting to see how Evelyn's demand would be handled. Mr. Evans and Matthew Hughes exchanged a quick but meaningful glance. Then, after a brief moment of thought, Mr. Evans nodded decisively and responded to Evelyn in a calm and polite tone, though the gravity of his words was unmistakable. "If you insist on this request, we will invite the captain to speak with you so you can hear the final decision. However, I want you to understand that the captain has full authority to make the final decisions regarding the safety and order of this flight. Please be prepared for that." Despite the veiled warning in Mr. Evans' words, Evelyn remained unfazed. In fact, she appeared even more confident, her eyes still holding the same arrogant air, as though she was certain the captain would side with her. She crossed her arms and stood firmly in the middle of the VIP cabin, waiting with a proud and defiant expression. About 2 minutes later, the door leading to the cockpit slowly and firmly opened. A man, in his 50s with a tall stature and neatly groomed gray hair under a captain's hat, walked into the cabin with a confident yet stern demeanor. This was Captain Thomas Reynolds, the ultimate authority on this flight. As soon as he appeared, all eyes were drawn to him. He walked straight toward Evelyn and Mr. Evans, his bright, calm, and authoritative eyes scanning the situation. Without wasting time, he asked clearly, firmly, but very calmly, "I am Captain Thomas Reynolds. I've just received the detailed information about the incident in the VIP cabin. Who among you would like to present the matter to me first?" Evelyn quickly stepped forward, eager to present her case, her voice high-pitched and filled with frustration, as if she were the real victim in the situation. "Captain Reynolds, I am Evelyn Stokes, a long-time Platinum Elite customer of the airline. I always sit in seat 1A when I fly. Today, that seat was taken by a boy, and all I asked was for him to move to another appropriate seat, but your staff sided with him and even suspended the employees just for doing their job in line with my rights. This is a severe insult that I cannot accept." Captain Reynolds listened intently, never taking his eyes off Evelyn, then calmly turned to Mr. Evans to ask in a collected manner, "Mr. Evans, has this matter been thoroughly verified?" Mr. Evans nodded confidently. "Captain, we have thoroughly verified it. Seat 1A was indeed reserved legally for Jalen Carter. Mrs. Evelyn Stokes had no grounds to demand that the boy vacate the seat." Captain Reynolds turned to face Evelyn directly, his voice now becoming more serious and resolute than ever. "Mrs. Stokes, I want you to understand one thing clearly. Your privilege as a loyal customer is to receive the best possible service within the capacity of the airline, but that does not mean you can take away the legitimate rights of another passenger. I am confirming once more that Seat 1A belongs to Jalen Carter, and he has every right to sit there for the duration of the flight." Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. She never expected the final decision to favor the boy. She tried to protest, but Captain Reynolds immediately raised his hand, signaling her to remain silent. His voice now carried an air of finality. "I also want you to understand that causing a disturbance or continuing to make unreasonable objections will affect the safety and order of this flight. If you continue to make trouble or disturb the other passengers, I will not hesitate to have you removed from this flight immediately." Captain Reynolds' final words sent the cabin into an absolute silence. Evelyn stood frozen, her face transitioning from arrogance to astonishment, then quickly flushing red with shame and anger. But she knew, deep down, that this time, her power and influence had been rendered completely ineffective in the face of the captain's final decision. In that moment, everyone in the cabin realized an important truth. Real power always lies in fairness and what is right, not in titles or social status. As for Jalen, the boy who had remained silent throughout, he now felt more relieved and proud than ever, knowing that truth and justice had ultimately triumphed over arrogance and injustice. After Captain Reynolds' decisive and clear words, the VIP cabin once again fell into a suffocating silence. It seemed as though everything had been resolved, and the passengers could return to the flight in a normal state. But Evelyn, with her pride severely wounded, refused to accept defeat in front of so many people. She stood still for a few seconds, her breath heavy, her face flushed with anger. Her eyes burned with fury, her hand trembling as she clenched her Chanel handbag, an accessory she always prided herself on carrying. Then, to the shock of all the passengers and Captain Reynolds, Evelyn suddenly stood up from her seat, her voice ringing out shrill, shattering the brief silence that had settled. "This is unbelievable. This is an outright insult and completely unacceptable. I won't let this go. Who do you all think you are, treating me like this?" Evelyn's inciting words echoed throughout the cabin, making the already exhausted passengers more uncomfortable than ever. Some began to sigh in discontent, while others exchanged worried glances, fearing that the flight would be delayed further due to this woman's stubbornness and defiance. But Evelyn seemed unfazed by the displeased looks directed at her. On the contrary, the attention only seemed to fuel her anger and agitation. She stepped into the aisle, standing tall as if delivering a public speech, pointing her finger at Captain Reynolds and the two senior airline representatives, her voice sharp and threatening. "Do you even know who you're insulting? I will make sure this airline pays dearly for your rude behavior. I will contact the biggest newspapers and my lawyer immediately. Your reputation will be completely ruined after this incident." Evelyn's threats only heightened the tension in the cabin. Passengers began murmuring, their worried whispers growing louder. Some checked their watches anxiously. Others shook their heads in disappointment at the loud and chaotic scene unfolding before them. Captain Reynolds remained surprisingly calm, but his face showed the seriousness of the situation. He understood that allowing a passenger to continue losing control could directly threaten the safety and security of all the other passengers. He stepped forward toward Evelyn, his voice still stern and resolute, but now with a stronger warning. "Mrs. Stokes, I have made it clear that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. I am asking you to sit back down and stop disturbing the other passengers. This is your final warning before we are forced to ask you to leave the plane." But Evelyn refused to heed the warning. Instead, she turned to the passengers around her, as if seeking their support and sympathy, loudly continuing her emotional tirade. "Can you see this? A loyal VIP customer like me is treated this way because of a child. Do you think this is a reliable airline to continue flying with?" Evelyn's provocative words started to have a negative effect on the passengers. Some began to show their displeasure, while many others became uneasy, fearing that the flight would not depart on time if this situation continued. A middle-aged passenger seated nearby couldn't contain his frustration and spoke up. "Ma'am, please sit down. We really don't want to be involved in your personal issues any longer. We need this flight to depart immediately." Evelyn turned sharply to the man who had spoken, her eyes filled with anger and contempt. "What are you saying? Do you understand that I am the victim of this unforgivable injustice? Why should I stay silent when my rights are being blatantly trampled on like this?" The atmosphere in the cabin now felt like a volcano ready to erupt, with every passenger acutely aware of the rising tension and discomfort. Captain Reynolds understood that the situation could not continue any longer. He immediately signaled to the two security officers nearby to approach. With firm certainty and without hesitation, Captain Reynolds addressed Evelyn. "Mrs. Stokes, this is my final decision. If you do not cooperate, we will have to take stronger measures to ensure the safety and order of the flight. You will be asked to leave the plane if you continue causing a disturbance." This stern warning from Captain Reynolds finally made Evelyn pause. For a brief moment, a flicker of genuine panic flashed in her eyes. She knew that the captain had the full authority to act on what he said, and she certainly didn't want to make a spectacle of herself by being forcibly removed from the plane. However, Evelyn's pride and arrogance wouldn't allow her to fully submit. She stood there, glaring at the captain and the two security officers, her hands trembling with rage and helplessness. In that moment, every person on the flight knew that Evelyn's next decision would directly impact whether the flight could depart on time and whether they could safely complete their journey. After Captain Reynolds' final stern warning, the atmosphere in the VIP cabin became taut as a bowstring. All eyes were on Evelyn, waiting for her next reaction. She stood motionless for a few seconds, her confidence and arrogance now beginning to waver. Her eyes quickly scanned the cabin, seemingly searching for some support from the other passengers. But all she saw were tired, displeased, and dissatisfied glances. At that moment, Robert Evans, the senior representative of the airline, who had been observing the entire situation with a serious expression, stepped forward decisively. Standing beside him was Matthew Hughes, the younger but equally serious colleague. Evans fixed his decisive gaze directly on Evelyn, his voice clear and firm, causing the entire cabin to fall into an immediate, dead silence. Mrs. Evelyn Stokes, after careful review and full documentation of the events from the beginning of this flight until now, we are officially announcing that your Platinum Elite status with the airline is hereby revoked. The reason is that you have severely violated the airline's passenger regulations and standards, disrupted the order, and impacted the safety and comfort of all passengers on this flight. This unexpected announcement hit like thunder in a clear sky, leaving all the passengers stunned. Evelyn seemed unable to believe what she had just heard. Her face instantly turned pale, her eyes wide with shock and intense anger. She took a small step back as if pushed by an invisible force. Her voice trembled, filled with both disbelief and panic as she tried to protest the decision. "What? How dare you do this to me? I've been a Platinum Elite member for years. I've always been treated specially by this airline, and now you're revoking my privileges just because I spoke up to defend my rightful demands?" But Evans immediately responded, his gaze still stern and unwavering. "Mrs. Stokes, we regret having to make this decision, but you must understand that Platinum Elite status does not grant you the right to infringe upon the rights of others or violate the flight's rules regarding order and safety. This decision to revoke your privileges is entirely justified and has been thoroughly considered." Evelyn lost control entirely. She flung her hands wildly, her voice rising to a screech, almost screaming in fury and frustration. "This is unacceptable. You will pay dearly for this. I won't let this go. I'll bring this to the media, and my lawyer will sue your airline to the fullest extent. You can't treat me like this." Evelyn's screaming reverberated through the cabin, making the passengers around her feel increasingly uncomfortable. Some people covered their ears, others turned away in exasperation. Everyone just wanted the flight to depart quickly and end the troublesome situation. Captain Reynolds stepped forward once again, his voice now sharper and clearer, full of authority. "Mrs. Stokes, I want to reiterate that this decision is final and unchangeable. You need to sit down in your seat immediately and cease disrupting the other passengers. This is your final warning before we are forced to involve airport security to have you removed from the plane." The stern warning from Captain Reynolds only made Evelyn more panicked. She kept shaking her head, denying everything, screaming in anger, pointing at Jalen as though the boy was the one responsible for the injustice she was facing. "Why are you standing with an unknown child against me? Do you know how much money I've spent with this airline? I'm the one bringing in the revenue, not that boy." Evelyn's words became more and more uncontrolled, causing the passengers around her to feel discomfort and pity. Some passengers could no longer tolerate it and began speaking up, urging her to be quiet or leave the plane as soon as possible so they could continue their journey normally. Meanwhile, Jalen remained seated, quietly witnessing the entire situation with an unexpectedly calm expression. He didn't feel any joy or satisfaction at Evelyn's predicament, but in his heart he felt a deep sense of relief. Justice had finally been served, and his legal rights were now clearly and publicly protected. As Evelyn continued to shout in protest, repeatedly claiming she was the victim of injustice, vowing to take the airline to court and take the matter to the press, the more she reacted, the more she revealed that she had completely lost control. She was no longer a powerful woman, but a desperate one, clinging to meaningless threats in her final moments. In that instant, everyone understood one important truth. No matter how great the power or privilege, it could not triumph over truth and justice. And Evelyn, who once thought she stood above everyone else, now had to face the harshest and most unforgettable lesson of her life. Evelyn's continuous shouting caused the VIP cabin to descend into chaos, more suffocating than ever. The passengers began to feel extremely uncomfortable, their gazes no longer curious but increasingly dissatisfied, even visibly frustrated. Evelyn, the woman who had just lost her Platinum Elite privileges, still refused to stop. Her anger and panic had completely overwhelmed her, leaving her with no control over her actions or words. Evelyn staggered down the aisle, her arms flailing with agitation, her face flushed with rage. She continued shouting loudly, insisting that she was the victim of injustice, trying to draw attention and sympathy from the surrounding passengers with threats of lawsuits and ruining the airline's reputation. However, instead of receiving support, she was met with cold, even mocking looks from the other passengers. At that moment, the airplane door swung open again, and two airport security officers, dressed in full uniform, entered the cabin with the firm steps. Their appearance immediately drew everyone's attention, and the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to freeze for a few seconds. The two security officers walked straight toward Evelyn, their faces stern, showing no signs of leniency. One of the security officers, a tall man with neatly cut hair, stepped forward and spoke clearly and sternly. "Mrs. Evelyn Stokes, we have received instructions from the captain and the airline's representatives. Due to your continuous disruptive behavior and failure to comply with the crew's instructions, we are required to ask you to leave the plane immediately." As the security officer's words rang out, the entire cabin erupted into a flurry of whispers. The passengers, though they had witnessed many tense moments, were still surprised by this strong and decisive intervention. While many appeared shocked, others began to breathe a sigh of relief, realizing that the flight could finally depart without being hindered by Evelyn's disruptive behavior. But Evelyn wasn't ready to accept being forced off the plane in such an embarrassing manner. She immediately reacted violently, her voice turning shrill, almost screaming in desperation and outrage. "You can't do this. I paid a lot of money for this flight. I have every right, and you're making a huge mistake. I will never forgive this airline." However, this time, Evelyn's angry screams were met with no sympathy or attention. Instead, all the passengers simply stared at her with looks of exasperation and fatigue, as if they had had enough of the noise and trouble she had caused. Evelyn could feel this clearly, and the truth of it only made her anger flare up even more. As the security officers moved closer, ready to escort her off the plane with firm but professional restraint. Evelyn began to struggle, flailing her hands in panic. But the strength of the two security officers was more than enough to control her actions. They were resolute, yet maintained their professionalism, slowly guiding Evelyn toward the cabin door. Evelyn continued to shout in protest, repeatedly claiming she would sue the airline, take the matter to the media, and that the airline would pay a heavy price for this. But her threats now seemed meaningless and grew weaker as she was slowly pushed closer to the door. When Evelyn passed by Jalen's seat, her eyes were filled with hatred and reproach, as if all the failures and humiliation she was experiencing were somehow caused by the boy. But in response to her gaze, Jalen remained seated in silence, his eyes bright and calm, looking straight ahead with no fear or wavering. He understood that this was not his fault, and he had no responsibility to bear any further insults. Finally, after a few minutes of futile resistance, Evelyn was forcibly removed from the plane. Her screams faded as the cabin door closed behind the security officers. The entire cabin instantly fell into complete silence, as if no one could believe that the chaotic and tense situation had finally come to an end. A few seconds later, the passengers began to breathe sighs of relief. Many turned to each other with smiles, easing the tension and discomfort they had felt earlier. Quiet conversations resumed, and the atmosphere of the cabin slowly returned to normal. A middle-aged woman sitting near Jalen spoke softly, but loud enough for him to hear. "You did the right thing, young man. Never let anyone disrespect you like that again." Jalen turned to her with a gentle smile, his eyes showing clear gratitude and appreciation for the heartfelt encouragement. He knew that, despite going through an unexpected and tense situation, he had stood strong in the face of injustice and successfully protected his rights. And now, as all the troubles had been resolved, Jalen felt more relieved than ever, ready for the flight to finally take off, leaving the chaos and challenges behind. As soon as the noise and chaos caused by Evelyn died down behind the closed airplane door, a sense of relief quickly filled the entire VIP cabin. The passengers, now able to relax and settle back into their seats, prepared for the flight to finally take off. The faces that had been tense and tired from the earlier ordeal gradually softened, as if they had just weathered a storm and were now witnessing a clear blue sky. Amid this atmosphere, Jalen Carter remained quietly seated in his 1A seat. His eyes were focused on the window, where the gentle glow of the runway lights shone softly, creating a serene and peaceful scene. But deep inside, Jalen knew that he had just gone through a memorable situation that he would never forget. It wasn't just a personal challenge. It was a profound lesson about the value of justice, determination, and the unconditional support of those who love him most. At that moment, Robert Evans, the senior representative of the airline who had observed and handled the entire situation with a serious demeanor, approached Jalen's seat with a formal yet friendly attitude. He gently bent down to Jalen's eye level, and his voice rang out sincerely, clearly, and with great respect. "Jalen, on behalf of the entire leadership team at the airline, I sincerely want to offer our deepest apologies for what you've gone through today. This is an important lesson that we will never forget, and we are committed to making significant changes in our policies and training to ensure that no passenger has to endure such injustice again." Jalen turned to face him, his bright eyes looking directly into Evans with a calmness and maturity far beyond his years. He smiled gently and nodded, responding to the heartfelt apology. "Thank you so much, sir. I believe this is a lesson that can benefit everyone. What matters most is that we recognize mistakes and take concrete actions to correct them." Robert Evans looked at Jalen with clear astonishment and admiration. He never expected a 15-year-old boy to show such maturity and admirable composure, especially after the intense pressure Jalen had just experienced. At that moment, the calm voice of Captain Reynolds announced that the flight was now ready for takeoff. The passengers immediately sat back in their seats, fastened their seatbelts, and mentally prepared for the journey that was finally beginning. The cabin fell into a pleasant silence, the hum of the engines growing louder as the plane smoothly lifted off the ground, rising into the vast sky. Jalen leaned back in his seat, feeling a deep sense of relief and peace spreading throughout him. He knew that everything had unfolded just as it should. But what made him most proud was his father, Marcus Carter, who had never hesitated for a moment to stand up and protect his son's rightful interests. In that moment, the image of his strong, steady father, always by his side, always protecting him, became clearer than ever in Jalen's mind. He knew that it was because of the guidance and support from his father that he had the strength to stand firm under pressure, and to understand the vital importance of maintaining integrity, respect, and self-worth. These values, his father always emphasized, could never be compromised or overlooked by any power or privilege. Weeks after that tumultuous flight, the airline officially issued a major public announcement, shared widely with the media and its global customer base. In the announcement, the airline committed to implementing a comprehensive reform program focused on raising awareness and providing extensive training on diversity, equality, inclusion, and ensuring that every passenger receives the respect and fair treatment they deserve. This information was met with strong positive support from the public, customers, and especially from Marcus Carter, who expressed sincere thanks to the airline for taking concrete actions to correct past mistakes. Marcus emphasized that only by acknowledging mistakes and being willing to change could one truly mature and earn the trust of their customers. As for Jalen, he read the announcement with quiet but deep happiness. He knew that not only had he stood firm to protect himself, but he had also played a small but meaningful part in a much larger positive change. Sometimes, what seemed like negative events could lead to lasting positive shifts that benefit everyone. And so, Jalen understood that the unforgettable flight wasn't just a personal challenge. It was a profound lesson in justice, respect, and the power of courage. Because only when we are strong enough to protect our rightful interests can we truly mature, be free, and be proud of what we've accomplished. Jalen Carter's story is not only an experience of turbulence on a flight, but also a profound lesson in courage, fairness, and the importance of standing up to protect one's legitimate rights. Sometimes, a small action can create a significant change, pushing a community toward higher, nobler values in life. What do you think about how Jalen and his powerful father handled the situation? If you were in his shoes, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and feel it has meaning, don't forget to like, share, and spread the positive message to others. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.